The last notion that I want to introduce in this discussion has to do with whereas plant community structure that we just talked about is defined as an assemblage of populations living within a prescribed habitat, landscape structure is defined as an assemblage of ecosystems interacting with one another in time and space. Going back to our diagram that I talked about earlier, we can talk about distinct species organized into metapopulations, metapopulations organized into populations, populations organized into ecosystems, and ecosystems then multiple ecosystems constituting a landscape. So this notion of landscape then is a notion of discrete ecosystems that contain discrete populations that contain discrete metapopulations. In this block diagram, we can talk about the agricultural landscape, the agricultural ecosystem landscape versus the alpine ecosystem versus the grassland ecosystem versus the forest ecosystem versus the wetland ecosystem associated with the river versus the urban ecosystem. So in this block diagram, then we can talk about landscape as a complex of ecosystems. We can define habitat across a geographic scale, as I mentioned earlier, and talk about individual wetlands by themselves within a complex within the landscape, and that complex existing within continental biomes. In terms of characterizing landscape structure, we use commonly 4 different terms to talk about the structure of a landscape. The first of these is called matrix. Matrix is the land cover that is dominant and interconnected over the majority of the land surface. In the diagram below, in the lower left-hand side and in the lower right-hand side, we have a matrix that is agriculture. This particular land cover of agriculture is the most dominant patch, and it extends over the largest area of the ecosystem. Same is true on the lower left-hand side. Within that matrix, we have patches of grassland, and we have patches of horticultural crops, and patches of trees. So those patches exist within a matrix of the dominant landscape. So patches are non-linear polygon areas that are less abundant than and different from the matrix. We can talk about this patch of forest within the matrix of agriculture, these patches of grassland within the matrix of agriculture. And then finally we can talk about corridors. Corridors are a linear assemblage, linear or elongated patch that links other patches in the matrix. So we can talk about the forest corridor along the streams, these stream corridor landscapes, helping to connect different portions of the matrix together and one patch type to another patch type. Then, in areas where we don't have a dominant matrix with patches and corridors contained within the matrix, we often wind up with what's called a mosaic. A mosaic is a collection of patches, none of which is dominant enough to be interconnected throughout the landscape. So in the center portion at the top of this image, we can see a complex of communities that include deciduous forest, coniferous forest, agriculture, grasslands, wetlands, shrub cover. So as opposed to having distinct matrix and corridors and patches, we have a mosaic of diverse communities assembled collectively. We can talk about landscape structure in different geographic settings. For example, in northern Minnesota, up on the muskeg marshes, we can talk about a patch of tamarack bog within the matrix of the muskeg marsh itself. And we can talk about a shrub corridor working its way into the landscape on the left-hand side of the slide. On the upper right-hand side, we can talk about an agricultural matrix the agricultural landscape that you see here being the most dominant landscape. Within that agricultural matrix, we have an urban ecosystem, we have different forest patches, we have a forest corridor. So this is the notion then of the matrix of agriculture with patches of forest and patches of farmsteads. We can even take this concept into the urban environment and talk about the urban matrix, the residential patterns and commercial patterns that exist dominantly within the landscape. And in this case, in Boston, the Back Bay area representing an open space corridor, a green open space corridor. Patch characteristics and habitat quality are quite significant because depending upon the type of patch, the quality of that patch, the size of the patch, its core area, its patch shape, and its edge structure, we can have very different characteristics within the landscape, very different levels of biological diversity within the larger landscape. Patch size and core area are very significant, where we can talk about larger patches, such as we see on the right-hand side here, having higher biological diversity than smaller patches, simply because they have more area to support a larger number of species and metapopulations. We can also talk about the presence of core area. Core area reflects that portion of a patch of vegetation that is removed from the surrounding matrix. So in this diagram, we have the patch itself, we have the matrix within which the patch exists, and depending upon how far in from the edge of the matrix you're going to get more and more area that is not influenced by conditions in the matrix. So this core area then adds a different kind of habitat than is true in edge conditions. And the larger the core area, then the greater the biological diversity that will be present. So overall patch size and size of core area becomes critical to understanding biological diversity among patches within a matrix. Similarly, patch connectivity. We can see these same three patches isolated by themselves and the same three patches that are connected by corridors. So this corridor connectivity then allows species from one patch to interact with species from another patch, with species from the third patch. And the presence of core area then gives these two patches an added bonus and makes it possible perhaps for species to migrate into this smaller patch here. Patch proximity is important. Patches that are geographically dispersed across the landscape, separate from one another, tend to have lower levels of interaction among themselves and lower levels of biological diversity than nearby patches. Species are better able to move from a nearby patch to another patch, whereas it's more difficult to move between remotely located patches. The presence of multiple patches in the landscape provides for A, a larger area, and B, a diversity of areas to be present in the landscape. When one of those patches is removed by urbanization or agriculture or some other disturbance regime, the effect on overall biological diversity is less significant than when that same patch is removed when it's in an isolated condition. So patch size, core area, the presence of multiple patches, patch proximity, and patch connectivity are characteristics that affect the biological diversity of patch and matrix and corridor relationships in the landscape. We can see the relationship of patch core to patch edge as the ratio of edge area in this diagram as the ratio of the close hatched area increases, the habitat value of the patch goes down. So we can see these two patches relatively the same patch area. This one has a higher percentage of core area, so it would have a higher level of biological diversity, generally speaking, than this similarly sized patch with a smaller core area and a much higher incidence of edge conditions. As edge undulation increases, this promotes more interaction with the surrounding matrix. And so in this patch that has a lot of different peninsulas in it, there's a large amount of interaction between the matrix conditions and the patch conditions. That level of interaction between matrix conditions means that matrix factors are going to come into and influence biological diversity within the patch. On the other hand, more geometrically shaped patches have a smaller amount of edge conditions relative to core conditions, so there's less disturbance from matrix conditions interacting with core conditions in the patch itself. Edge width becomes important as a wider edge condition is going to provide more protection of core areas from surrounding landscape conditions. And finally, there's what we can call an ecologically optimum patch shape, which has a geometrically shaped area that is large enough to contain a significant amount of core area, and then it has fingers that reach out into the landscape to help connect this patch to other patches. So this amoeba-like feature reflects the optimal conditions from the standpoint of patch shape. The value of corridors is accentuated, enhanced, when the core area can consist of, when a patch corridor consists of both edge conditions and core conditions. The reason for that is that the presence of a core reserve in the corridor itself allows for core species from this patch to interact with species from this patch. Had this connector been much more narrow, there wouldn't have been the extent of linking corridor that connects this core reserve with this core reserve. So the idea of corridors is that they provide connective tissue in the landscape, and when the corridors contain core reserves throughout the corridor, the value to biological diversity is significantly higher. Here we see habitat value of corridors where a patch of forest is connected to multiple patches. When that corridor is broken by agriculture or by fire or by some other level of disturbance, the connectivity between this patch and the second patch is broken up, reducing the level of biological diversity within the landscape. To the extent that corridor conditions can mimic and follow hydrologic patterns in the landscape, stream systems, lake systems, we get a higher level of biological diversity. We can talk about stepping stone connectivity, where even though we have a lot of small patches in the landscape, if they're arranged in a pattern that allows them to provide connectivity between two large patches, as we see on the left-hand side of the lower left diagram and the right-hand side of that diagram, even though these patches are by themselves small, they are close enough together and they provide a bridge, if you will, a series of stepping stones, allowing species from the left-hand patch to interact with species in the right-hand patch. We can see in the upper right diagram where we have two patches that are completely isolated from one another, and two patches that are completely connected one to another, and that perhaps have core conditions. So core conditions from this patch run through the corridor into core conditions in this patch. In the second most right-hand diagram, that level of connectivity is broken once, but species might still be able to cross that landscape. In the third image, we have stepping stones, and species need to be able to move from one stepping stone to the other in order to interact with species in these different core areas. And then finally, these isolated cores have the lowest level of interaction between the top patch and the bottom patch. So the notion of stepping stones, strategically positioned small patches, can provide connectivity within the landscape and thereby increase biological diversity. We can also talk about habitat value of edge conditions, what we refer to as soft conditions versus hard conditions. Hard conditions are where there's a very abrupt edge between the patch of vegetation and the surrounding matrix. Here we can see in this coniferous forest, there is a very, very abrupt distinction between the forest landscape and the open landscape. In the diagram on the left, we can see that there's a gradual transition from the forest landscape, understory and shrub layers reaching out into the surrounding landscape. A much softer surface makes it easier for species to move across the landscape. This condition, the hard condition, makes it more difficult for species to move from the forest landscape across the open landscape into another patch. We also can see the hardness of this edge in terms of its horizontal alignment. Not only is it vertically straight, but it's horizontally straight, whereas this patch condition is both vertically diffuse and horizontally diffuse. So it's easier than, more possible for species to move out of this patch into surrounding patches. We can see this gradual transition of the soft edge where the understory vegetation and shrub layer vegetation of the forest community is reaching out into the surrounding landscape, making interaction between the patch and the surrounding landscape more likely to occur. So patch distribution and habitat quality, the distance to nearest neighbor is important, the value of stepping stones is important, the ability to connect these patches together, the corridor connectivity in relationship to hydrologic and physiographic pattern is important, and the redundancy in network connectivity. In this image on the lower right, we can see a pattern of three patches that have redundancy in the sense that species can move from the center patch to the upper right patch to the lower to the upper left patch, or they can go the other direction. So there's some redundancy in terms of direction of travel of movement that species can use to move from one patch to another. We can talk also about the effect of removing of this critical stepping stone patch, wherein here we have this level of connectivity between this three-patch complex and this three-patch complex. If we take out the patch with the X in it, then we have two isolated sets of patches, the three patches in the lower right and the two patches in the upper left. So the habitat value of network connectivity, the habitat value of circuitry, and the habitat value of redundancy cannot be overemphasized when we talk about habitat structure, habitat quality within the landscape. Relative to this condition in the upper left diagram, where the corridors are essentially unidirectional, the system where exactly the same patches has a higher level of connectivity, network connectivity, makes it possible for species to move among and between within these patches much more readily than is true of the system of the linear core area, the linear corridors that connect the same patches. Where we have circuitous patterns, that is to say where there are multiple pathways for species to get from one location to another. For example, species from this patch can go either this way to this patch and down to this patch, or it can go from the center patch across the linear corridors and eventually to the same patch. So this notion of circuitry, this notion of connectivity, and this notion of redundancy, making it possible for species to move across the landscape, are quite significant when we think about patch, corridor, and matrix in the landscape. And also then trying to coordinate the vegetative pattern of patch, core, and matrix with the hydrologic or physiographic pattern, wherein we can talk about a bottomland forest condition helping to connect many different patches within the landscape. And we can see then in the upper left diagram the riparian forest corridor helping to connect different patches of forest within the overall landscape. There is some circuitry, some redundancy, and it's possible for species to move from this patch to this patch through the corridor system that is defined both by vegetation and by hydrographic and physiographic patterns. And we can talk about the compatibility of the matrix with its surroundings. In the upper left-hand diagram, this muskeg landscape that we talked about earlier, we can see that the compatibility between the larch patches and the muskeg marsh is quite smooth. There's a high level of compatibility, whereas in the urban landscape, the level of compatibility between the residential landscape and the open space landscape is more significant. So as compatibility increases, the relationship between one ecosystem and another ecosystem will promote higher level of biological diversity. Similarly, when compatibility decreases, the level of biological diversity will decline. We can use these principles, these different concepts, in terms of large forest interior core area, close proximity to another forest patch, large amount of undisturbed forest, large amount of remnant vegetation, forest is entirely in upland conditions, large total forest area. And for a given landscape, we can rate the patches and the matrix within that landscape for each of these 6 different parameters and assign a rating value to them and combine those rating values to come up with a composite score. So we can begin to talk about the habitat value of one forest patch with the habitat value of a second forest patch. And we can see that based upon these criteria and the way they have been evaluated in this particular landscape, patch A has a significantly higher habitat value than does patch B.